также располагает различными средствами поражения. А по отдельным
This isn't a rumor. It isn't even a story. It's a pivot point in modern history. One conversation, unrecorded, unacknowledged, and unplanned, reshaped Russia's entire approach to Africa. Tonight, I'm taking you inside that midnight exchange. It was long past midnight in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The city slept beneath a blanket of West African silence. Inside the presidential residence, a single lamp burned against the darkness. President Ibrahim Traoré remained at his desk. Maps of Africa spread across the polished wood. Handwritten notes and briefing folders stacked like small fortresses around him. His aides had drifted off hours earlier. Traoré stayed awake, pencil in hand, outlining strategies for his country and perhaps for a continent awakening to its own strength. Then, at precisely 3 a.m., the red phone rang. No minister would dare interrupt him at that hour. No general would risk it. That line existed for conversations of the highest stakes, moments that could change the trajectory of nations. Traoré hesitated. Every instinct told him this call would be no routine briefing. Finally, he lifted the receiver. Ibrahim. The voice was low, deliberate, marked by a Russian accent. "This is Vladimir Putin." For a moment, Traoré said nothing, letting the name hang in the dark like a sudden thunderclap. What followed would never appear in official transcripts, but its echoes would stretch far beyond the Kremlin and far beyond Africa. Putin wasted no time with formalities. This was not a call about trade agreements or polite diplomacy. It was something deeper: survival, trust, the shifting architecture of global power. The Russian president spoke of how closely Moscow had been watching Burkina Faso, not merely its military maneuvers or political shifts, but something less tangible, a spirit stirring across Africa, a refusal to be managed by any outside force. And he confessed something few Western analysts would believe, that this African awakening unsettled the Kremlin almost as much as it rattled Washington or Paris. For decades, Putin said, his English careful but clear, Russia, like the West, has approached Africa for resources and influence. But now a new energy rises. Leaders like you who cannot be controlled. Then came the warning, heavy as lead. Independence is expensive, Ibrahim. The West is not your only challenge. Even Russia struggles to keep its sovereignty. Traoré listened in silence, absorbing the rare admission. This was not the usual power play. It sounded almost like respect, and perhaps a plea. Putin described pressures closing in on Russia itself: economic sieges, cultural isolation, the long grind of war. "They want to break our backbone so the world will never again believe resistance is possible," he said. "And they will come for you too. They already begin." The words were no prophecy to Traoré. He had felt the quiet threats, the rumors of plots, the subtle squeeze of foreign influence. But hearing it laid bare by a man who had endured decades of confrontation sharpened the reality. "There will be offers," Putin continued. "Promises of aid, of partnership, of democracy. But every offer carries a chain. You must decide now. Are you ready to suffer for the freedom you speak of?" The room felt suddenly heavier. For the first time, the Russian president was not speaking as a rival power broker, but as a man who understood the loneliness of sovereignty. Traoré finally answered, voice steady. "Mr. President, Africa has already suffered colonialism, slavery, exploitation. The question is not whether we will suffer. The question is whether we will stop suffering for others and begin sacrificing for ourselves." Silence. Then a slow exhale from the other end of the line, as if Putin had waited to hear exactly those words. "That is why I called you," he said at last. "You remind me of Russia before the storm, before isolation, before sanctions. I see in Africa what the world has forgotten: courage. What came next startled even the Burkina leader. Putin admitted that Russia's own history in Africa was far from innocent. The Soviet Union, he said, had sought allies against the West and exploited Africa's resources while making grand promises it often failed to keep. "We were not blameless," Putin said simply. "We wanted influence. Many of our pledges turned hollow." It was a rare confession from any world leader, let alone one so often painted as unyielding. And it carried a message deeper than apology. No empire, Western or Eastern, approaches Africa without self-interest. The Kremlin, Putin continued, is not what people imagine. Yes, it holds power. Yes, it seeks advantage. But it is also afraid of losing what independence remains in a world of empires dressed as democracies. He paused, his voice softer. That is why I respect you. But remember, destiny makes enemies. The conversation stretched toward dawn, thick with the weight of history and the uncertainty of the future. Putin was not maneuvering for control. He seemed to be searching for understanding, perhaps even solidarity, and Traoré recognized something unexpected. For all Russia's might, it too felt the vulnerability of a nation fighting to remain itself. When the line finally went silent, the clock had crept past 4 a.m. Traoré set the receiver down, stared at the wide map of Africa before him, and then out the window toward a horizon still wrapped in night. The Kremlin no longer appeared to him as an impregnable fortress. It looked instead like a mirror, reflecting the universal struggle for sovereignty. The first light of morning edged across the city. Burkina Faso's leader understood that the call was not an alliance, not a bargain, but a challenge. Africa must stand on its own, equal, sovereign, and free. Outside the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, dawn slid across the quiet city. The streets were still, the air cool before the day's heat. Inside, Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless, replaying every syllable of the 3 a.m. call. It felt less like a conversation and more like a revelation, one that peeled back the myths surrounding global power. By sunrise, he had summoned his closest advisors. They entered the room expecting a routine briefing. Instead, they found their president unusually reflective, the faint scent of strong coffee hanging in the still air. He did not disclose every detail of the discussion with the Russian leader, but his words carried an unmistakable weight. The Kremlin does not sleep easy, he told them. When a giant begins to fear, it shows you its true face. His aides exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Traoré had been warned about Western pressure, covert influence, even assassination plots. But hearing that Moscow, often portrayed as an untouchable fortress, shared similar anxieties startled them. For the young leader, this admission from Putin was more valuable than any alliance. It confirmed what he had long suspected. Every empire, east or west, approaches Africa with hidden motives. As the day unfolded, the significance of that midnight exchange began to ripple outward. Within hours in faraway Moscow, Putin's inner circle was briefed on the conversation. Some of his senior advisors were taken aback by the president's candor. Rarely did the Russian leader speak so openly, admitting past missteps and exposing the Kremlin's own vulnerabilities. A few cautioned that Traoré might twist the narrative for his own advantage. Others whispered that the African president was too young to be entrusted with such geopolitical honesty. But Putin silenced the doubts with a single remark. He must know. The world is changing, and Africa is no longer at the edges. Meanwhile, rumors flickered across diplomatic networks. A late-night call between the Russian president and Burkina Faso's head of state. No official confirmation existed, but the whispers were enough to spark curiosity in embassies from Paris to Washington. Over the following weeks, those whispers evolved into calculated disinformation. European newspapers carried leaks claiming secret weapons talks between Moscow and Ouagadougou. Anonymous intelligence briefings hinted that Traoré was aligning with Russia to destabilize West Africa. None of it was true, yet in international politics, perception often outweighs fact. The narrative was forming. The young African leader was becoming the African Putin. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré read these headlines with a calm that unnerved his ministers. He recognized the strategy. Smear first, isolate next. The West would frame him as a puppet of Moscow, even if his only late-night interaction with Putin was a single phone call of shared vulnerability. But beneath the surface, something more profound was happening. Across the continent, the mere idea that Putin had reached out in the dead of night to speak with a 36-year-old African president electrified public conversation. If Russia's formidable leader felt compelled to call, what did that say about Africa's rising importance? In markets from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, people debated the mysterious call. What could have been said? Was Traoré negotiating new alliances, or was something larger at play? The speculation itself shifted perceptions. For once, Africa wasn't the backdrop to someone else's drama. It was the focal point of a geopolitical riddle. Within Burkina Faso, Traoré drew a deeper lesson. Putin's honesty about Russia's own history of exploitation confirmed that neither East nor West approached Africa without self-interest. If Moscow could admit its failings, perhaps Africa could leverage that admission to build a new kind of relationship, one based on truth rather than illusion. Still, the phrase that haunted Traoré most was Putin's quiet warning: "Destiny makes enemies." Those words looped through his mind as the weeks passed. He had already felt the subtle attacks, economic pressure, whispered plots, sudden diplomatic cold shoulders. Now he saw them not as random acts, but as a pattern. When he finally addressed the nation in a major speech, he never mentioned Putin's name. Yet every line bore the imprint of that early morning conversation. "Great powers speak as though their empires will last forever," he told a packed audience in Ouagadougou's central square. "But tonight, I tell you, even empires tremble. Africa need not bow to Moscow, nor Washington, nor Paris. Our destiny is our own." The crowd erupted, the words carried across the continent by radio, television, and a storm of social media posts. Commentators from Johannesburg to Nairobi dissected the speech, sensing its deeper resonance. It was a declaration that Africa's struggle for sovereignty transcended Cold War-style alliances. Thousands of kilometers away in the Kremlin, Putin listened to the recording. He neither smiled nor frowned, merely nodded. "He understands," he murmured to his advisors. "The young man understands." For Putin, the call had been a calculated risk. But in Traoré, he recognized a leader who would not be anyone's pawn, not Russia's, not the West's. And perhaps that was precisely what made Africa both a threat and a hope to the old order. As months passed, analysts coined a phrase for the exchange: the 3 a.m. Doctrine. Columnists speculated endlessly about the conversation's contents. Some claimed Putin begged for African partnership. Others insisted he delivered a warning of secret Western plots. No one outside those two men knew the truth, but careful observers noticed a subtle change in Traoré's tone. He no longer described Africa as a region needing protection or guidance. He spoke of Africa as inevitable, an emerging center of gravity in a world of fading empires. In private moments, Traoré reflected on what he had truly gained. Not a treaty, not a military pact, but clarity. The realization that every empire, whether draped in the language of democracy or in the symbolism of resistance, is ultimately fragile. Even empires bleed. He understood that Africa's path must be forged without leaning on Moscow or Washington. Partnerships might come, but dependence was a dead end. The midnight call hadn't provided a roadmap. It had revealed a truth: sovereignty demands courage, and courage invites opposition. One evening, nearly a year later, Traoré stood again at his desk, the same map of Africa unfolded before him. Outside, the city hummed with life. He thought of Putin's voice, calm, deliberate, carrying both power and fatigue. He thought of the future, a continent young, vast, and determined. Africa's time, he realized, was not approaching someday. It was already here, and somewhere in Moscow, perhaps, Vladimir Putin understood that too.